Now, many will have heard of the massacre of Oradour-sur-Glane. The 2nd SS, the Das Reich, were at Bordeaux on D-Day. Then they were instructed to move north towards the landing zone. The resistance were trying to stop them, kept attacking them, and as a reprisal, they spent the 10th of June massacring a village of Oradour-sur-Glane. Now, drama happened here, not the same scale, but just as tragic. Now, the planes bringing the paratroopers in were supposed to come in serials, which is a formation of up to 45 planes. There'd be 3 planes would make a V, and then 3 Vs would make a V of 9. Then you could have 5 rows of these 9 planes to make 45 planes, all flying together. That's over 800 men, and they'd all drop together, be a formidable fighting force. Because that was the plan, and as many things, it went wrong on D-Day. Now, the planes were supposed to home in on a beacon, which had been set up by the Pathfinders 15 minutes earlier, and they'd home in on the beacon, and then when they got to the landing zone, they'd see the lights on the ground, and they'd all jump. Except when the planes came over the Channel Islands, they came under flak, and then they went into a cloud bank as they crossed the coast of Cotentin. And when they came out the clouds, many of them were dispersed because they couldn't see each other. And so then they didn't know where to go, because only the lead plane of 9 had the receiver. Now, I bet you're thinking, if I was hot, I'd take off the scarf before the jacket. But what we do with the microphone then, huh? Riddle me that one. Now, 150 paratroopers were dropped 15 miles south of the landing zone, which was Amfreville, over the horizon, over that way, to the north. 12 planes of 53 carrier group came over this way, and they were well off course, but they were actually in a formation, as they're supposed to be. But the lead hadn't followed the right flight plan, so he didn't pick up the beacon, even though he had a receiver. And so, probably confused by these floods, the men dropped over here. The pilots probably thought they were near Amfreville, where there were floods. Now, being lost in the floods, in the marshes, the obvious place to go to was this beacon that stood out from the marshes on this hill at Graignes. So they all headed here. It was bad luck being 23 kilometres away from the drop zone, but it was good luck to be in this village, because being in the backwater in the middle of the marshes, it wasn't occupied by the Germans. One of the few villages to have no Germans in it. It wasn't convenient for the Germans to put men here because it's so isolated. And Marthe Rigault remembers early in the morning on the 6th, paratrooper knocked on the door, and when they opened it, he said, "Don't be worried, we're friends, we're Tommies." It was Sgt Broussard. He was a Cajun, so he spoke a sort of French, and then he was used as the interpreter later on. They thought they were liberated. They didn't know what was going to happen though. Marthe His, who lived in a farm just by the marshes, recounts the first paratroopers arrived at 1 a.m. They had some coffee, then left. At 5, more came back. Then there were 120 around the farm, in the stables, in the school, presbytery, and the church. They used the tower as a lookout. The first paratroopers to arrive at Graignes were led by Sergeant Leroy Brummit. Now, they showed the villagers their map, they spread it on the table, and the villagers pointed to a place off the map. They realised they were a long way from where they should have been. Around midday, a second group of paratroopers arrived, led by Major Johnston. Now, Captain Brummit, he'd concocted a plan to exfiltrate the men during the next night across the floods. His reasoning was that they were HQ company, They had no combat training like the other companies did. They had no heavy weapons, no jeeps, no room to manoeuvre. But Johnston was the higher grade, and so he won the day, and they were going to stay put. It wasn't only 82nd men that arrived here. There were some 101st men, there was an RAAF man, and some men from the 29th Division who landed on Omaha Beach. In the afternoon, a group of paratroopers from the 501st, 101st Division, led by Sergeant Loyal Bogart, they arrived. They'd been extremely dropped, although they weren't so far from where they should have been. Bogart injured his leg when he dropped. With his injured leg, Bogart wasn't much use in a combat role, but Johnston put him in charge of the switchboard and in the communication post, which was in the boys' school. The rest of the B Company men were placed in the outlying defences. The two other 101st Airborne arrived. They were from the 81st Airborne Anti-Aircraft Anti-Tank Battalion. They'd landed shortly after 4 a.m. on the 6th in a Waco glider near the Brianderie. The 29th men, they arrived on the 9th after participating in an attack on Marthe-sur-Graignes, which is the other side of the Veer from where they were initially. They got separated, ended up here by crossing the bridge to the north. An RAAF pilot was there, that's the Royal Australian Air Force. He'd been in a Lancaster bomber, bombing Caen, and he'd been hit, but he managed to limp 20 miles west before it crashed. He was the bombardier. He managed to bail out near Saint-Jean-de-Day. Now the locals brought him here because they knew there were American soldiers here. He was Flight Sergeant Stanley Black. There were also two Spaniards, and they'd escaped from a forced labour camp. They could also speak English and French, so they were used as interpreters. The mayor, Alphonse Voidy, he got the willing townspeople to take the men in and provide food for them. The men were in the school, the presbytery, and in the church. The women were cooking non-stop to provide 2 meals a day. They had to go to the next village to bring food in. They're also digging up stuff from their gardens to make sure there was enough. An aid station was set up in the church, run by Captain Abraham Sophian, with medics from the 507th and the 501st. Now, even though it was peaceful, they had their work cut out already because a lot of the men jumping into the floods, in panic, they'd been hacking at their risers and they'd wounded themselves. On the 7th, they could see across the floods towards Saint-Georges-de-Beaune there were movement of German troops going northwards. Johnston set up an outpost defence with landlines for communication. The locals went out to find canisters dropped at the same time as the paratroopers. Marthe Rigault loaded them into a horse and cart and covered them in straw to hide them from an eventual check by the Germans. On the 10th, elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadiers were near Graignes. The 17th SS had been near Tours in the west of France on D-Day. They were instructed to move up to Normandy. They were split into 4 march groups and took separate but parallel paths towards the Channel. The route the 37th Regiment took passed near Graignes. On the 10th, a reconnaissance patrol of the 37th Regiment ran into an outpost of Lieutenant Meon of the 101st. They let them get close, then opened fire. 4 Germans were killed. The only way into Graignes from the north was across this bridge at the Port des Planques. The fact it's called the port relates to the fact that the canal was used to transport goods and people when roads weren't abundant. So they could go from Vire to Carentan along the canal. Johnston sent Naughton with 10 guys to guard the bridge and also to set explosives on it in case he needed to blow it to stop Germans coming. They saw some Germans coming and they let the first ones go past and they fired on them. And a firefight broke out and this house was badly pockmarked during that fighting. And then the men pulled back over the bridge and blew it. So the bridge was blown. Now the Germans, or the German army soldiers, weren't actually German, they were Ukrainians. They'd been sent from Vai to patrol south towards Graignes. Now Naughton's men recounted they were surprised how these Ukrainians just walked towards their machine guns. The Germans now knew there were paratroopers in the area. During the night, the outpost could hear movements of the Germans. D-Day was a Tuesday, so the 11th was a Sunday. On the Sunday, everything was calm, so Major Johnston gave permission to the troops to go to the Mass. Marthe and Marthe Rigault were there, as well as many other parishioners. The Mass was led by Father Walter Leblatter. He hadn't got far. After 10 minutes, he stopped talking because they could hear gunfire. And a woman ran into a church shouting, "The Germans are coming." Now the troops went out and the civilians stayed in the nave of the church. In 15 minutes, the fighting was over. Johnston realised this was probably a probing attack and instructed Brummit to reinforce his defence line south of the town, which is just down there where the hippodrome is now. At 2 p.m, the Germans started a light bombardment from Thionville with 75mm guns. This was followed by a second attack on Brummit's line. The Germans trying to outflank him, but Brummit skillfully managed to counter their attack, held them off. The Americans were being helped by their own 81mm mortars and being directed from the top of the church tower. The wounded were being treated by Captain Sophian with the medics and also with the help of the two priests. During the following lull, Brummit realised they were running low on ammunition. He spread out what they did have between the men. Sounds of vehicles were heard. Lieutenant Pitt Reed could see with his binoculars that the Germans were setting up guns at Thionville. Johnston told the civilians to leave the town. At 7 p.m, a shell ripped through the belfry, killing First Lieutenant Farnham and other men. With the observation post gone, the mortars weren't so useful. With relentless pressure, the Germans worked their way up the hilltop. The outposts were now isolated. Johnston directed Brummit to pull his defence line to a predetermined position. The machine gun team were just about to move when they both killed. Brummit scooped up the machine gun and the box of ammo and moved. He jumped over a wall being used by shelter by two men, and they both killed as he landed. Brummit now returned to the hilltop. Sergeant Major Saluski informed him that Johnston had given orders to move to friendly positions. He was then told that Johnston had been killed. Brummit decided it was time to go. He led the surviving men to an assembly point. He didn't know that Captain Sophian and the medics and the wounded were still in the church. At the end of the final assault, the Germans stormed the church and Captain Sophian's aid station. Some wounded were taken to a pond and stabbed, then pushed in. Now it's not at all clear what happened to the men killed on the hill after the third attack of the Germans. The legend says that Johnston was wounded when the school fell on him after being bombarded by the Germans. Then he was in the aid station, and then the Germans burst into the aid station and they took some wounded away and killed them, and they marched the rest towards Zabuhailo, and near this bridge on the Teret, they shot them. But it's highly probable that Johnston actually left the aid station with Sophian, and they went south and then west. Then they approached this bridge and they saw a guard on it, and Johnston went to attack him. One of the men with him was killed, and so Johnston tried to surrender, and then all the men were shot. That's why their bodies were found here by the Terrette. 30 men had been killed on the hilltop. Frank Naughton's group got out by being taken across the floods by Marthe and Marthe Rigault. Brummit led about 80 men across the floods, arriving at Carentan on the 13th. Some went into hiding around Graignes. The legend of Graignes says that the Germans burnt down the church on the 12th, but it was still standing on the 17th of June. It might well have been hit by the approaching Americans in July. That church towering above the floods could be a great lookout for the Germans. No villagers were there after the battle. 5 civilians were supposedly shot by the Germans on the 12th. The 2 priests were apparently shot. The Germans knew they'd let the Americans use the bell tower and killed them in reprisal. They could also have been killed in the initial bombardment. After the battle, the Germans told everybody to get out of town. 2 women, Eugene Dujardin and Madeleine Pézeril, were loading up a horse cart in order to leave when the horse died. They were still there in July when a patrol came through the village and finding them still there, shot them. The 5th was Albert Morguet. He died in August after finding some explosives which killed him. The legend also says that this action stopped the 17th SS being at Carentan before it was taken on the 12th. Elements of the 17th SS were at Saint-Hilaire-du-Petitbon on the 10th of June. The action at Graignes held up 1 company.